Trigger warning. This episode contains descriptions of bodily harm and injury. Chapter 7. The Loch Ness Monster. People often lovingly refer to the Loch Ness Monster as Nessie, and have long since actually been wary of the creature. Accounts on the Loch Ness are rare to find, not only for the fact that the legend itself has been dragged away from its origins and morphed into something else, but also due to the fact that the creature is extremely solitary. Such is the story of this chapter's character. I've been able to pull records directly from the Edinburgh police station, due to the fact that this particular case is ancient, from the 1940s. The investigator has long since retired and is now bedridden. Detective Ulysses Brown, it seemed, dedicated his life to this case, and the Edinburgh police were more than happy to hand this closed file to me, a PhD student at the time. I was young and still new to my research when I was given it, but I wanted people to know it was the work of a cryptid, so in the hopes of informing, I wrote a narrative on the case, and had it published in the local paper. Time passed and the publication didn't get the attention I intended, but as I put together this book, I realized there is still use for it. The story was published under the title, The Monster Awakens, Reports of a Creature Near Loch Ness, and begins as such. It was raining the day Detective Ulysses Brown had been assigned to this case. His boots sloshed with the early spring mud, and his hat caught wild and rampant raindrops as he walked to the crime scene. A fisherman had been walking around the loch early this morning, trying to get a look at the day's catches, and now, hours later, here he lay, mauled. A crack of thunder sounded in the distance as the rain grew heavy against Brown's back. The local town police took a look at his badge and let him through to closely inspect the corpse. Brown was from Edinburgh and had taken a train to get here, his reasoning being that he was tired of city cases and how cramped everything felt, small compared to the rolling hills of this vast, spring-green countryside. Oliver Davidson, one of the policemen, informed him as the detective took in the body. Brown turned to the man. "Know him?" The policeman had laughed, but Brown noted how his eyes were looking away, like they were trying to ignore, to forget whatever was in front of him had actually happened. Time was passing in the moment itself. It's a small town, detective. Everyone knows everyone. Brown nodded. The rain pelted down into a shower as he leaned down. The smell of fresh blood was dense and metallic. The body was marred with giant teeth, as if something had bitten him, right in the side, face, and leg. The teeth marks were strange, spiky, consecutive. He was no genius detective, nothing out of the ordinary, but something about those teeth felt wrong. His mind went through the possibilities perhaps 100 times. Bear? No. There wasn't any near the town or the loch. Wolves? Again, none. What did that even leave? Pine martens? No, the marks were too big for that. The zigzags of the red indents in the fisherman's body were clearly due to something of an animal, a creature. What? The sky cracked with thunder again, and Brown almost flinched. Perhaps there really are dolphins in the loch. Brown's gaze turned up. A gray-eyed man with blonde hair was kneeling towards the bite, near the man's face, as he studied. He looked at Brown. "Alfred Buchanan, the only criminal lab specialist around here for this business." He offered a gloved hand. Brown nodded at the hand. "Detective Ulysses Brown." Buchanan pointed to the jagged lines of the teeth marks, the zigzag. "They remind me of a dolphin's teeth." Brown refuted, "But those are more jagged." And Buchanan sighed. "So they are." Brown's eyes wove over the body again. The victim's shoes were practically falling apart, a contrast to the rest of his clothing that looked put together. No, the thick shoes on Davidson's feet looked like they were peeling, the leather cracking in splotches. He asked one of the local police officers about the fisherman again, and then found himself leaving, winded from the downpouring gray afternoon. Buchanan caught up to him, and a quick partnership was born. The man was somehow the only person in the police force whose eyes didn't look distant. They walked into the crumbling police station, wringing off coats to dry, and sat down. Davidson was known by many, Alfred said, observing Brown, who was observing Alfred's sparse offices. We were always worried about him. He was a frazzled old man. Seeing him finally die, to us, is like seeing your senile grandfather finally pass. Meaning he may have not been all there in the head? Brown pulled out a note and pen. There were already scribbles about the crime scene from earlier in there. I suppose so. Always in his boat near the loch all day, every day. Not to fish, but just to look into the water. Buchanan crossed his arms and observed the watch on his wrist. We should get to the lab. There are still answers his injuries can give us. After that, Detective Brown found himself researching the man's family records. His research was fruitless, however, leaving two possibilities as his only lead: an animal attack or mental illness, both of which were not promising, but they were something. The rain had gone and left a humid smell in the air that lingered like a shadow. As he walked through the town, he felt odd. It was so very small. Not small and clustered like the city, but small as if you could see the edge of the street in the horizon and the loch ahead. The houses were small. The hope in the people's eyes nearly none. The hills around them were tall in stark difference, providing some beauty, but more distance and coldness. He had come here by a train, and as he checked into a motel, he was able to figure out that the train only ran weekly from here to Edinburgh. He couldn't leave until next week. The thought suddenly dawned on him. He couldn't believe he hadn't come to the realization. If he died here, it would be a week before anyone knew. The rest of the world would go days without knowing he no longer existed. His family back in the city, they would spend their days, that week at least, in ignorant bliss. This town was less than a speck on the map of the world, much less. He wondered, if he died here, would anyone in this rundown town even bother to tell his family in the city? Perhaps Alfred would. Or perhaps they would just move on with their lives, slowly, like an old beast, and time would pass. The motel room phone rang, rattling through the small room like a screaming rooster at dawn. Brown flinched at the shrill sound and reached over to pick it up. Ulysses, I'm in the lab. Just finished writing up the last of my observations for Davidson. Brown spoke. Anything? It's definitely not dolphin marks, Buchanan responded. Of course not. Is there a chance someone set another animal loose near the loch? Any exotic pet owners? Buchanan cut him off. Detective doesn't match any animal. Brown blinked. What? Silence. I checked, but not a single animal matches the teeth markings. Matches at all. It's close to other species, but Brown shook his head. He was already writing all this down in his notepad. You're saying this is an undocumented animal? A voice on the other end sighed. I think I need you to come over, Detective. The lab was a desolate place. It hadn't been hard to find. Like everything else in this town, it was small and meek. He opened the front door, and the smell of formaldehyde filled his nostrils. The lab reeked of it. There wasn't anyone in the entryway. A sinking feeling hit him, and he ran through the aging wooden door, labeled lab. There the body was. Rigor mortis had stepped in and made the bite marks look like they had practically indented the pale skin of the corpse, like a stamp. On the tray next to the body was a hastily written note and a pair of keys. Brown snatched it, his heart dropping at the contents of the paper. It read, visiting the loch. If this is an undiscovered animal, I have to act fast. There might not be another chance to document it. Brown crumpled the note and shoved it in his pocket. He glanced at his watch. It was only around 9:30 in the night. He knew this was bigger than the murder now. This undocumented animal meant much more than a deceased man who was already a dead man walking, even when alive, with his obsession with the loch. He had enough sense to realize Buchanan going alone was dangerous, and he was about to follow suit when he glanced at the keys left for him. The tag on them specified them as Davidson's house keys. He looked between the body and the keys. Buchanan had left them for a reason. He turned to leave. The lab was now fuming with chemical odors, and Brown couldn't stand it anymore. Then his eyes fell on the corpse's feet. They were swollen, and Brown felt his eyes widen, burn from how wild they looked. Pale skin wrinkled as if it were filled with something. Trench foot. He had seen it on the marred soldiers of earlier wars and on people that had worked long hours standing in the water. He jotted it down and shoved Davidson's house keys into his pocket. Dark had fallen outside and the street lights did little to help. The wind was picking up again. He knew as he reached Davidson's house that there would be a storm soon. He knew it from the smell in the air that carried with it a wet breeze. He unlocked the door to Davidson's house with a turn of his keys, and the insides made him want to slam the door shut again. Decay lined the walls like picture frames. The rotting of the furniture and walls seemed as if it would consume him with dread. A small one-story house held so much abandon. He almost walked right back out into the inviting storm of the night. One sight kept him there, though. Davidson's dining table, one leg broken and crawling with termites, had an old news story on it, written and scribbled over vividly, as if trying to prove something that only he could see. His eyes narrowed and he leaned down, making out the words under the dark ink. A small thing, a footnote from 1933, an image that he could just barely discern above the words. It looked like the loch, with something poking out. Brown had a hard time believing the article Davidson was looking into, but the day's events seemed to line up, and he was sprinting now through the compact town, with its small street lights and wavering old fences, where no one would know if someone died, where no one would care. No one would know, no one would care. His breath was catching against the harsh wind, and the sprinkles of rain that he could see with his small torchlight as it ran over trees and more trees. The loch was so big, he was so small. He needed to find Buchanan, but what if the man was already lost? What if this creature Davidson was so obsessed with had taken Alfred as well? His stomach was hurtling with this new terrifying feeling. His hand shook, and the torchlight wavered. He had no time to search the radius. It was night. His light would run out. An innocent person would die. He was so minuscule. Detective Brown couldn't think of a single rational way to search for his new colleague against the might of the storm. He couldn't think of a single way to save him from the beast. So logic went out the window. An hour, two. The rain got worse as he wandered the loch with growing desperation. The cold sunk deeply into his wrists as his torchlight flickered. His coat and shoes were soaked. His eyes tired, when miraculously he saw a figure sitting at the bank. Brown had not a single clue where he was, but he ran, bellowing out the man's name. The officer turned as Brown neared. The detective shone the light over him and stopped. Buchanan's eyes were rimmed with red. His shoulders were drenched with rain, and he shook vehemently. Brown shrugged his heavy coat. The man would suffer hypothermia if he hadn't already contracted it. Buchanan suddenly stood and took a step back, his feet sinking into the water of the lake. "I get it, Detective, I get it now." Buchanan's voice sounded quiet against the rain. I must pause the story for a second to mention a few points. Brown's writing gets uncharacteristically distant from this moment on to the next few paragraphs. He writes about how the two descend into an argument, Brown trying to get Buchanan to come back to town and the latter refusing. Buchanan's words to Brown remain fascinating, however. The story continues. The man talked with a hollow tone. Brown left to listen. It sounded like nonsense. Words of a madman who is far too winded from the rain to make sense. He tries to ignore the sinking feeling again. These words he would never forget. Buchanan says to him, "You and I are nothing against it. This town is nothing, not even a speck." His words struck like a lash. Brown opened his mouth and no words came out. There was something behind him. The heavy rain pelted down as Buchanan's eyes widened, pale and empty. Brown knew then that there was nothing he could do. Davidson woke it. It was hibernating. Like a bear, it was sleeping. It would have slept all through our lives, our grandchildren's too. Time is so small, don't you think, Detective? taller it grew behind him, a neck craning and craning and craning. Buchanan sniffed. Even this moment is insignificant to it. Its mere teeth are older than our ancestors. The teeth. He broke from Brown's embrace to laugh, the action causing him to take another step back. I thought it was dolphins. The thing behind him in the water opened an eye. Brown froze. He wanted to run. There was no step he could take that would get him away from this thing. How could he have ever thought so? Buchanan was right. Time was small, a fragile thing, and he was worse. He was so trivial. All of my research is in my lab, were Alfred's last words before the beast rose, ever so slowly from the depths of the loch. The sheer movement sent a wave at least the size of a 12-story building crashing down on the two men on the shore. Brown, who stood facing the ocean, saw the wave coming, but poor Alfred was swept away in an instant. A searing scream screeched against the storm, and the muscles in Brown's legs sprinted. He had no idea where, how. The wave caught him anyways, and he woke up the next morning against a tree. He limped back to the small lab, collected all of Buchanan's research in its characteristic hasty handwriting, and started to walk. He didn't care if the train wouldn't run. He didn't care that he had left Davidson's body there. He eventually found a cab after a day of walking, with Buchanan's work with him in a box. Back in Edinburgh, he continued to work. This leaves the question, did Brown run into a real Loch Ness monster? The narrative ends there. Alfred Buchanan was listed as missing. He still is. And while Brown dedicated his life to this case just before retiring, his research was more focused on trying to find Alfred Buchanan than our cryptid itself. Looking over it, I can safely say, it did not amount to much I didn't already figure out. Meanwhile, Davidson's obsession with the Loch Ness sighting in 1933 was more harmful than helpful. He was less an intellectual and more of a fanatic. The small town situated around the loch was dismantled only a decade after Buchanan went missing. The question is why, and who did it? To me, it seems someone realized the monster's presence, and ever since then, the Loch Ness monster has become something else entirely. After visiting the loch myself a few times, it is critical to note that the monster's presence is no longer there. Has it fallen asleep again, or has it gone somewhere else entirely? Time means little to the monster. We are specks of dust to the Loch Ness monster. If it were to attack again, we would be nothing but footnotes in the saga that is its story. This concludes Chapter 7.